Hello everyone, how's it going? It is Tyrnor, as always, and this is a new series I'm trying out, and as such, feedback is especially welcome about 5 things I like and 5 things I dislike about the lore of an expansion. I'll also talk a little bit about what I think the defining trait of an expansion's lore is, and what I think of it. Bear in mind that everything in this video is just my opinion, you are of course free to disagree, and also keep in mind that I will be talking about lore, not game mechanics, although I may reference them, but lore. I will also not talk about expanded universe works associated with an expansion, so for instance if a novel takes place during the story of an expansion, I will not talk about the events of the novel in these videos, since these are for the game only. I also have to mention that these 5 things are not the only things I like about this expansion or the only things I dislike about it, but rather my top 5, I guess you could say. I also mentioned that they are in a very loose order, so for instance, the third thing I dislike won't be number 3 on the list, something I dislike more than number 4 or 5 or something. So here's how I envision the structure of this video. I'll first say a few words about what I thought of the general direction of the expansion's lore, in this case of vanilla World of Warcraft. Then I will talk about the things I dislike, and afterwards the things I like, so we can finish on a positive note. So, first things first, the general direction of vanilla's story. There isn't one. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, nor is it necessarily a good thing. In vanilla you're basically dropped into this wide world of, well, Warcraft, with various stories, some interconnected but most not, and that can be both something positive and something negative. Generally, it's a good thing to have something to tie things together, to lead them in a direction in order to tell a more effective story. Vanilla, however, wasn't trying to tell a story exactly, but rather a multitude of smaller stories. This has the advantage that Vanilla wasn't exactly dependent on the success of a bigger story. For example, if Deathwing proved to be a crappy villain in Cataclysm, the whole story of Cataclysm would suffer. However, it made much of the lore of Vanilla seem rather small in a way, with of course some exceptions. Regardless, looking at the MMOs released today, and sure, most of them don't hold a candle to World of Warcraft, if Vanilla had been released today, leaving aside the gameplay mechanics, its story would be viewed fairly negatively. All the major MMOs to release today have a major story driving the action forward, while Vanilla promised to just be, hey, the World of Warcraft, the world of those RTS games you played, kind of like an open sandbox. My point is that we may be driven to view Vanilla's story in a negative fashion because we see things from today's point of view, when in actuality there are some nuances involved. Building off of this, let's move on to 5 things I dislike about Vanilla's story. Firstly, that everything felt static and nothing seemed to progress in the lore. So for instance, you'd learn that this Tauren camp was menaced by Quillbore, or this human village by gnolls. You'd get the idea from the quest that you would be getting to solve the problem, except you wouldn't. You'd just thin their numbers or assassinate some of their leaders with the implication that, oh, hopefully they will leave when they don't. Not really, not ever. Now, this was in part limited by the technology of the time, since phasing wasn't a thing until very late in Burning Crusade, but it felt like much of what you'd be doing, with a few exceptions, would be for nothing other than getting some loot and experience. Secondly, and moving on to something more specific, I have to say would be the Syndicate and its leader, Alden Pernold. The Syndicate, in my opinion, had such great potential for a story. They were the survivors of a kingdom universally hated by every other state in Azeroth, turned to a life of corruption, crime, and guerrilla warfare, and Alden especially had great potential for a story as the son of the traitorous King Aedan Pernold, the rightful heir of the kingdom of Ahn'Qiraj. It would have been so interesting to see his growth as a character, how he gathered his people during the wreckage of his kingdom, and how indeed the transition happened from an occupied territory of the other human nations to basically a giant ruin. These people had the potential to have a great story since they have reasons to be opposed to the players, but are not necessarily evil themselves. Of course, though, in-game they're just a bunch of goons you kill on sight, and Aludan dies because he stole Tarifa Foxton's necklace randomly. Thirdly, I have to mention the pomposity, I guess you could say, of many of the bosses in vanilla. Basically, everything at this time, everything had to sound like it came out of a Shakespearean play. And sure, that may be rather epic, maybe more epic, but it can also be, and was, rather silly and unrealistic. Just as an example, I'll read off Majordomo Executus's line after you defeat him. Brashly you have come to wrest the secrets of the living flame. You will soon regret the recklessness of your quest. I go now to summon the Lord whose house this is. Should you now seek an audience with him, your paltry lives will surely be forfeit. Nevertheless, seek out his lair if you dare. In all fairness, most of this stuff applies to endgame dungeons and raids. Edwin Van Cleef, for instance, has more believable lines. Fourthly, the large amount of unfinished quest lines and stories. Fairly often you'd embark on a gripping and very interesting quest line, only for it to lead nowhere. The example that springs to mind is the Durotar quest line where you infiltrate the Burning Blade, and at the end Thrall basically says, well, when you're big enough to handle Ashenvale, we'll continue the story. But you don't. Every so often you just get these unfinished stories that led basically nowhere, even though many of them were some of the more interesting questlines of vanilla. And lastly, and perhaps my biggest gripe with vanilla story, is the raid and dungeon archetype. Basically the idea that 5 to 40 people will clear out a major threat, and that's that. It's a problem with all of the expansions of World of Warcraft, but I'm putting it here because vanilla started this. It's perhaps the biggest and most annoying Deus Ex Machina that exists in Warcraft's lore. That this idea that, oh, an elemental lord showed up? Send 25 people at it. Oh, an old god is steering things? 10 people should do. Later expansions do try to mitigate it, I suppose, by not having it just be 10 or 25 or however many people clear a problem, but by having them be part of a larger story, such as in Cataclysm where you needed the help of the dragon aspects and the dragon soul to defeat Deathwing, or in Wrath of the Lich King where you didn't technically beat the Lich King, but rather he was just toying with you until Tyrion beat him. But in vanilla, these groups of 20 or 40 people would just kill anyone, even admittedly weakened deities. It would be especially annoying when there would be 5 people instead decimating entire armies and societies, like the Razorfen Quilboar or the Dark Horde of Blackrock Spire. Now technically you can say that this originated with the now non-canon RPG, where a few players could basically do anything. No joke, there is actually a mission in the RPG books where you can kidnap the Lich King, for instance. So now that that's out of the way, let's talk about some positive things regarding Vanilla Story. Firstly, as you probably know by now, I am a big fan of Nefarian. I love his entire storyline in Vanilla, with his experiments with the chromatic dragonflight. I thought it was an interesting new direction since basically black dragons used to be just, "Brr, I'm a black dragon, I burn things." Nefarian took it into a new direction with the mad scientist approach, I guess you could say. Secondly is probably a well-known questline which was actually preserved in Cataclysm, namely the Darrow Shire questline. It was a great quest chain with an emotional story, and it was, frankly, pretty unique in vanilla. In fact, even Chromie, a bronze dragon, empathized with the story to the point where she helped, after all. Thirdly would be Moira Bronzebeard's storyline, basically of how you are told that she was kidnapped by the Dark Irons. You eventually go to rescue her, you kill Emperor Forest-san, only to discover that she was there of her own will and was pregnant. It's probably one of the greatest plot twists in vanilla World of Warcraft, and it paved the way for one of my favorite characters in the lore, namely Moira. It's a short quest chain, but it's still great, and I also really love Moira's line in the final quest. Return to Ironforge and tell my father that the heir to the kingdom of Ironforge will be a dark iron dwarf. Whether he approves or not, it shall be. Now, fourthly would be the status of Stormwind in vanilla. Basically, Stormwind was a corrupted wreck in vanilla World of Warcraft, basically having lost control over most of its regions and having major problems with kobolds, gnolls, and most of all the Defias in the regions where it's not so. It was honestly kind of surprising that they would present the country as being in such a mess, and every time you would help with a threat in Westfall or in Duskwood, the quest givers would say, if only Stormwind would send some help already. Not to mention the fact that Stormwind was without its king in vanilla, and the regency was manipulated by the mysterious Lady Katrana Prestor. She was also indirectly the cause of the creation of the Defias Brotherhood, which I also think was one of the best storylines of vanilla. This situation also led to the Missing Diplomat quest chain, one of the better quest chains of vanilla, yet one without a real satisfying end, in the sense that you don't really find Varian, you just find some of his kidnappers. And of course there's also the Marshal Windsor quest chain, where you unmask Lady Katrana Prestor and reveal that she's actually the Black Dragon Onyxia, who was working to deliberately sabotage Stormwind. And lastly, but not least, would be the War of the Shifting Sands and Fandral Staghelm. Now, for the most part of vanilla, Fandral was portrayed as kind of a dick, and also he did a bunch of shady stuff, and especially since he was in conflict with the more fan-favorite characters of Tyrande and Malfurion, he was not seen very favorably. However, he was greatly developed during the War of the Shifting Sands, or the Ahn'Qiraj quest storyline, which established the personal tragedy which drove his character, and made him one of the more interesting tragic characters of the story. The War of the Shifting Sands and the Ahn'Qiraj questline was also very interesting and well done, really one of my favorite stories in World of Warcraft so far, all of it. And I suppose this is the end of this particular video. Leave any thoughts in the comments below, and I look forward to hearing your feedback. So, I'll see you all later. Farewell.